This is my final design project in which students will be creating a geometry town on Google Draw. So before we understand the project, it's important to understand the learners in this classroom. This is a 4th grade class made up of 9 and 10-year-olds, and as you can see from the criteria listed, this is a very diverse population of students. Therefore, differentiation in this classroom is huge and is a part of every lesson. I have students who speak multiple languages, I have students with IEPs, and I also have students who receive gifted services, so differentiation in this classroom is a big part of it. So prior to this unit, students will have gained a lot of knowledge of types of lines and types of angles. So they'll have a really good understanding of parallel, perpendicular, and intersecting lines, as well as acute, obtuse, and right angles before starting this unit. So the learning objectives are pretty straightforward. The first one is really activating that prior knowledge and making sure that students have a good understanding of parallel, perpendicular, and intersecting lines, as well as acute, obtuse, and right angles before moving on to the next step. Which brings us to objective 2, which is talking about taking those geometry terms and taking that geometry knowledge and applying it to classifying different 2D shapes. Then taking all of that knowledge and being able to follow directions for a final geometry assessment, which will be them being able to design a town in Google Draw. So I'm going to be using Gang's model as the main strategy throughout this unit. So instead of having all 9 steps in one day in one lesson, the steps will be spread out across the unit. So gaining students' attention and getting them invested will come on one day, and presenting the stimuli might come on a different day. So it's very spread out throughout the unit. The biggest part would be step number 9, enhance retention and transfer. And this is really where the students designing the geometry town using Google Draw will be present. So day 1 of instruction is going to start by me asking students the question, how is geometry used in everyday life? This is to kind of anchor the project and make it really connect to the real world. So once students have had a chance to think about this question, talk it over with their classmates, talk it over with myself, I'll introduce to them the idea that they're going to take all this geometry knowledge and create a new section of their town. But before we can do that, we need to make sure we have a solid understanding of different terms in geometry to be able to complete that task. So we're going to start with recalling our prior knowledge, which includes the different types of lines and angles, and students will go through the kinesthetic movements that they've already learned as a whole class, and then with their math partners before starting on their homework, which will include students being able to identify parallel, perpendicular, and intersecting lines, as well as acute, right, and obtuse angles. On day 2, the teacher will present students with a variety of 2D shapes and clarifying the attributes that those shapes have. So for example, understanding that a square is a square because it has 4 right angles, all sides are equal, and opposite sides are parallel. So going through different shapes with students and understanding how to look for parallel lines, how to look for different types of angles. The teacher will then just demonstrate how to complete the Sage and Scribe worksheet. So essentially what Sage and Scribe is a way to structure partner work that has one student instructing another student how to solve the problem instead of them just completing it by themselves. So once I've demonstrated Sage and Scribe and reminded students of the steps, then they will go off with their math partners to complete work with Sage and Scribe on their own. So here's what the Sage and Scribe page will look like, and as you can see, there's a variety of shapes, so students will pick a shape and say, okay, this is a rectangle, and it has 4 right angles, it has 2 sides that are parallel, and those same 2 sides are equal. And their partner will record that information, coaching when necessary, and then they'll switch roles. So day 3 is kind of different in the sense of different students will be working on different things. This will be the time for me to meet with a small group of students who is struggling with this content, and also a time for me to give students who have a good handle on this content something more to work on. So this might involve students working in partners, some students might be working in a small group with me, some without me, just to kind of make sure we all have a good handle on the content before day 4. Now day 4 is the big one. This is when the geometry task will be introduced, and it will be time for students to become town planners, put all their geometry knowledge to work. So I will be presenting students with the Geometry Town task and showing them Google Draw. Now it's going to be different on Google Draw because I will be wanting students to use the Polylines tool. So when you're using the Polyline tool, you're able to draw your polygon the way you want it to be. So you can make a closed figure that might not be available in the shape. So students will be encouraged to use the polylines instead of simply using the shapes that are provided to them through Google Draw. So there's a bank of shapes that are available to them, but students are going to be instructed that they need to be using the polylines to create, especially shapes with obtuse angles, to make it fit the criteria that it needs to fit. So here are the directions for the Geometry Town. There is a list of different criteria of roads, of streets, of buildings, of parks, different things that their town needs to include. Again, using that polyline tool instead of just simply selecting different shapes. Day 5 is going to be a work day. Day 5 is a time for students to get this task completed. So students will be able to ask each other questions, ask questions to me, to kind of get clarification on things they might be confused on. I anticipate that students will have questions, but I feel as though a lot of those questions will be able to be answered by peers, of working in their groups, of asking me, to kind of get everyone on the same page and getting going on this task. So day 6, I anticipate that there will be a number of students who have finished the task. So those students are going to be starting to peer edit with a checklist. So students will be able to share their Google drawing with a partner. That partner will open up the Google Draw, open up the checklist, and look to see, did my partner meet all these criteria? That partner will be able to leave comments. They'll be able to click on things to say, like, this doesn't actually have 4 right angles and it needs it, to give feedback to students before turning it in. So once students have gotten feedback, fix those things they need to fix and submitted it, then it's going to be their turn to write a task, to actually make the directions for a new town. Again, during this time, I'll be checking in on students, making sure everyone's on the right track, making sure that students are where they need to be. Here's the checklist that students will be able to use. Essentially, it's just the criteria that were given to them on their initial task page, but separated out so that a peer can look at this and say, yes, they have a town name. Yes, they have one road that's perpendicular to 3 parallel streets. So they can kind of break this down and help their partner be able to correct anything that needs to be corrected. Finally, day 7 is wrapping up the project. It's getting the extra teacher guidance or peer guidance that students need, and finishing up that peer editing. This is the day they'll share that final project with me and submit it. On this day, students also will be taking a survey about the project for me to get some feedback on, was this a good project? Did students enjoy it? Do they feel like they're learning this way? Are there ways that it could be improved? So that the following year, I will know to use this project or just throw it away and use something else. So here's a sample artifact of what a student's Geometry Town may look like. So you can see that the black rectangles represent streets, there's an avenue, there's a road, there's different buildings, everything has a label, everything has a color, and in this particular case I added some trees. I have a group of very creative students and I know that they would want to add little touches like that to their artifact. So my summative evaluation will assess students' final Google Draw submission. So it won't necessarily be one that I looked at before. It'll be that final one that they've gotten peer edits, maybe they've gotten comments from me on prior. That's the one I'll be looking at. And I'll be looking at that same checklist that peers were looking at to see, did this student meet this criteria? The other part of this evaluation will be the student survey. How did they feel about it? How is it going for them? There are 2 major modifications that can be made for students with this project. The first being giving them a 2D figure bank. Like I showed before, using that Polylines tool could be a little too much for some students, and giving them that bank of shapes would still require them to understand what are parallel lines, what are different types of angles, but it takes that burden away from it and allows students to be successful in a different way. The other modification is more teacher guidance. Obviously, if students are struggling and not understanding as well, that's when they'll get some one-on-one time with me or in a small group to kind of narrow down where they need the most help instructionally. So that's my Geometry Town unit.